I'm Eleanor Wachtel, and this is Writers and Company. Today, the winner of the 2017 Nobel Prize in Literature, from England, Kazuo Ishiguro. His most recent novel, The Buried Giant, is about love, revenge, and lost memories. Kazuo Ishiguro is one of England's finest writers. I've been following his work almost from the beginning. We first spoke more than 20 years ago, in 1995, when he published his unusual, unsettling novel, The Unconsoled, whose hero is so detached and disoriented, the book has the feel of an anxiety dream. This came to mind when I read the citation of the Swedish Academy, which stated that Ishiguro, in novels of great emotional force, has uncovered the abyss beneath our illusory sense of connection with the world. Kazuo Ishiguro was born in 1954 in Nagasaki, the son of an oceanographer. When he was 5, his family moved to England, but only temporarily, at least that's what they thought. After university, Ishiguro started off in social work, first in Glasgow, then in London. His passion was rock music. In fact, he says it's only because he didn't make it as a guitarist and singer that he became a writer. He certainly met with success right from his very first novel, A Pale View of Hills, published when he was 27. His second, An Artist of the Floating World, won Britain's Whitbread Award. But it was his third, The Remains of the Day, that catapulted him to international fame. It won the Booker Prize, it sold more than 1 million copies in English, it was translated into 40 languages, and was made into an Oscar-nominated movie starring Anthony Hopkins and Emma Thompson. The Remains of the Day is a kind of virtuoso piece of writing, a perfectly controlled, sustained narrative of an aging butler reflecting on a lifetime of service. Subtly, inexorably, what leaks out is a tale of misplaced allegiance and self-deception. Ishiguro says that what interested him was not so much the quintessential Englishness of the butler, but rather the failure of emotion, which is, in a way, Ishiguro's theme, the inability to live inside feelings, to inhabit reality, to understand loss. This is both true and not of Ishiguro's last 2 novels. Never Let Me Go from 2005 evoked an almost science fiction world of clones, students, and premature death. But love and loyalty were also present, as they are in his last novel, The Buried Giant, alongside Ishiguro's trademark theme of loss or absence, in this case caused by a fog that erases memory. The book, his first in a decade, is set in early Britain, after the Romans, just after King Arthur. I spoke to Kazuo Ishiguro when he was in Toronto in 2015. Your new novel, The Buried Giant, takes place in early medieval England. This is the legends of King Arthur and his advisor, Merlin the Magician, are still part of recent history. Why did you choose that period?
Well, I didn't actually start off thinking I want to set a book in this period. It was almost the last piece of the jigsaw for me. I started off wanting to talk about some place where the historical memories of dark events had somehow been buried. And maybe, from a generation, 2 generations back, something had happened, but they'd buried the memory successfully. Ethnic communities were managing to coexist in relative peace, side by side, intermingling. But something was going to erupt, because the peace had been enforced not through negotiation, but through just military victory. So that's the situation I needed. Of course, that many contemporary situations may come to mind, and I did actually entertain the thought of setting it not in some far off semi-mythical landscape, but in one of the recent historical arenas of conflict and societal memory erupting into ethnic hatred after a generation or 2. But then I didn't want to end up talking to you. Well, I always wanted to end up talking to you on a show like this, but not necessarily talking about a book specifically about, say, the collapse of Yugoslavia in the 90s, or the Rwandan genocide, or even about Northern Ireland, the sectarian disputes there.
There's so many
the
examples.
Middle East. Yeah, we
Sri
could go on and
Lanka,
on. Yeah,
the Tamils.
exactly. If I had written a book set in one such place, we would now be, dissecting the history of that particular place, what happened, the details of it. My habit is to kind of take a little bit of a step back and suggest that there are recurring things in human experience that keep repeating over and over again. So I decided I would almost retreat into a semi-mythical, semi-historical kind of environment.
Although I understand it wasn't even so much the stories of Arthur that you responded to as even as a child, but tales of samurai warriors in the East and tales of gunslingers and cowboys in the West. I mean, can you tell me what interested you there?
Yeah, well, I was born in Japan. All through my growing up, I was told Japanese folk tales, some of which involved kind of the supernatural. The supernatural and the real seem to coexist quite nicely in a lot of those kind of samurai warrior tales. Typically some samurai will wander into some town and they'll be saying, look, we've got a real local problem here. There's a demon that keeps appearing on that bridge. Could you please get rid of him? And he'll say, okay, I'll do my best. I mean, that kind of thing seemed to be very everyday. So, and then there was Homer. I'm a big fan of kind of ancient Greek stuff and the Iliad and Odyssey. And I've always loved Westerns, Hollywood Westerns, and also the Italian Westerns. And I guess the portrait of Sir Gawain in my book, an aged Gawain, kind of left over from some past more glorious era. He's probably influenced by a lot of these aging gunfighters you see in the later Westerns of people like Sam Peckinpah or the later films of John Ford. These old aging gunfighters, still quite dangerous and powerful, but they're out of time. Their era has passed. The country around them has got more civilized. There's no place for a man of violence like that, and they're lonely figures. A man and a horse, almost like a community of two. In a wide open landscape, unable to really move with the times, but still keeping up some kind of old set of values. I mean,
so was it Gawain who put you into that time period?
Well, no, as I say, it wasn't Gawain himself. I mean, I think I had a view of a figure like that. I have to say the Arthur in my story probably doesn't have that much to do with the Arthurian legends. When I was looking at that period in British history, that's to say the mysterious gap between when the Romans leave Britain and when the Anglo-Saxons settle it, and it starts to become English. There's a blank period.
It's around the 5th century?
Well, the Romans leave in 410 AD. That's fairly well established. And around 490 AD, by 490 AD, the place has become Anglo-Saxon. It is turning into England, The indigenous people that lived there with the Romans, the people I would call the Britons, some people call them the Romano-Celts, something happened to them in that gap. A lot of people think they got wiped out, or that there was a piece of ethnic cleansing, because everything just becomes Anglo-Saxon more or less overnight. So the Arthur that I became interested in was that people think there might have been a historical basis for King Arthur, of the legends, in a real military leader who would have been one of the Britons, one of the native Britons, who was a resistance fighter to the hordes of immigrant Anglo-Saxons landing from the European mainland. And at some point, it is thought he won some kind of big decisive victory, which imposed a kind of a peace and an uneasy coexistence between the two tribes that went on for at least a generation or two. So that's rumoured. So nobody really knows what happened in that period. No historian is confident. So I thought, well, I'll go with that version because it suits my purposes. So that's where the Arthur thing comes in. It's a quasi-historical King Arthur.
And Sir Gawain is his nephew.
Yeah, well, I just went with the myth there. Sir Gawain is usually thought is the youngest of the knights of the Round Table. He's the nephew. He has a poem all to himself in English literature, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. I mean, people know about him. I thought it would be fun to have the aging leftover knight, the last knight from that era, who is still trying to impose that old peace that was settled forcibly on the country. I thought it would be fun to have him as Gawain, now old and a bit like Don Quixote, a bit like one of these worn-out John Wayne characters.
That's who I was thinking of, yeah, a bit creaky. In this case, literally, in his rusty armor.
Yeah, he's kind of comic and he's a bit pathetic, but actually he's still quite a formidable warrior too.
Apart from language, and I guess religion, because the Britons were Christians, what were the differences between the Britons and the Saxons?
Well, that's quite an important difference. I mean, the Britons would have been converted to Christianity by the Romans. And so they have a nominal smattering of Christianity on top of, I guess, generations of pagan traditions. But the Anglo-Saxons, the people who will become the English, at this point, they're pagan. And so this is not only a source of just tribal tension. At a crucial point in the story, the Saxon warrior expresses his anger at the idea of a God, a Christian God that is infinitely merciful, and because it facilitates all kinds of brutality, because you can be forgiven the next day. Yeah. He's saying, well, what kind of a God is that you believe? I mean, you committed all these atrocities in the past that you've kind of buried, and you think you can just get away with it because you've invented a God that will forgive you anything. What use is a God that just forgives you for anything, as long as you pray and you act out some pious things, maybe some self-inflicted wounds or whatever. But I mean, that's not justice, So and maybe there is, there's a question raised there. That is there something actually about Christianity, which was the religion of the nations that went out and created their empires with some brutality and ruthlessness. I mean, is there something about Christianity that enabled people to do this without feeling too bad about it? Because it was in the name of Christianity they did this often, and also because they thought they can be forgiven.
Just to go back to this world of the buried giant, there are ogres and pixies and dragons, and we don't exactly believe in their existence today, but what do stories about them tell you about the people of that time?
Well, I think the important thing is that it was perfectly reasonable for the people of that time to believe in these things. I mean, if you live in these kind of huddled little villages, and until you get to the next settlement, there's kind of dark, wild moors, and it's perfectly reasonable to believe that all kinds of supernatural forces out there. This is a pre-scientific, superstitious time, so I went with the idea that if a reasonable person could actually believe in certain things like ogres or pixies, then I would allow them to literally exist in my fictional world. I would grant them their superstitious beliefs. And they're there in my book for very important reasons. They stand for very important things. For instance, I mean, if you got ill in those days, you didn't have a scientific explanation for why you got ill. I mean, somebody close to you, somebody you love, seems to be suffering and dying. You want to know why. And the idea that maybe you remember, several months ago, I heard something moving in our room in the dead of night, and it was probably some sort of sprite or a pixie. And that's when it happened. That creature brought some illness and brought it to my wife, and that's how she got ill. That seems to me as good an explanation, given what they knew at the time, as any other. And so in my pre-scientific Britain, the pixies in this particular case, they are very closely associated with illness and aging and death. And the same with the ogres. They exist for they have a particular role. They're extras in my story, but they're important extras. I need them to represent certain forces.
Because sometimes they speculate other kinds of forces. For instance, in The Buried Giant, a mist of forgetfulness has enveloped most of England. And one theory is because of God's anger, or maybe even God's shame, that he himself doesn't want to remember because of what the people did. Well, I mean, how does that work?
Well, they're speculating. I mean, the main premise of this story, and this is what I had before I had the setting or anything, this was going to be a story about a nation that was suffering from some kind of strange collective amnesia. It's a very selective amnesia. It seems to have nothing to do with aging and dementia. The old people in some ways remember more than the young people. Around certain topics, around certain kinds of issues, people have a blank, so they forget even what they were talking about the previous hour. And it's probably something to do with this mist that's all over this land. It's a very misty place. It's a story about remembering and forgetting. When is it better for a nation to remember some things? And when is it better to leave certain dark passages from the past just buried for the sake of the cohesion of the society, for the sake of not starting another cycle of violence or civil war or just disintegration? Sometimes you have to just, even if it means great injustice is served, even if it means atrocities go unpunished, sometimes you just have to just say, let's just forget it. Let's all agree to forget it. Maybe sometime further down the line when we're stronger, we'll come back to this. But right now, the only way we can impose some kind of calm and peace and stability is to everyone to agree to forget everything that happened. I guess people have done that many times in recent history as well. After the Second World War, many of the countries of Europe that had been occupied and collaborated with the Nazis, to this day they live in great tortured conscience about what they did. But everyone's agreed to forget what happened. Or somewhere like South Africa, I think it's a miracle that South Africa has gone 20 years. They've avoided bloodshed and civil war, and they very consciously tried to balance that question of how much should we remember, how much should we forget.
Because within your novel, what are the pros and cons of living without that collective memory?
Well, I don't want to generalize. I think there are many there are arguments for remembering, arguments for forgetting. In my novel, this question about when is it better to remember, when is it better to forget, is applied not just at the societal level I've been talking about, but also at the personal level of a marriage. Here's an old couple. Their shared memories seem to be fading, and they're really worried that what would happen to their love for each other if the shared memories of the many years they've spent together are disappearing. So they initially set off on this journey to try and recover these memories. They're looking for some lost son. They think if they find the son, a lot of things will come back to them. But as they go on, they start to really fear finding these memories. It occurs to them that, like in any long relationship, there are dark passages that they have buried. And maybe there is something about this forgetfulness that has helped them to sustain their love. Would their love survive the resurrection of these dark memories from the past, of what they've been through? But on the other hand, if they don't, I guess they sense that their time together isn't long now, although they never articulate this to each other. They're getting old, she's ill. So the question arises, if they don't actually look at these buried memories, resurrect them and look at them, is their love actually a real love? Is it based on something false? And so a part of them really wants to look hard at everything that they've been through, but they fear it. They don't know what's going to come back if this mist goes away.
Because they alternately make each other promise to remember the love they feel in the present moment, just in case something bad is uncovered, and each fears they've somehow betrayed each other in the past. But ultimately, retrieving their memories becomes very important to them.
I guess, it's like a lot of the books I wrote in the past, which really revolved around one individual. Books like The Remains of the Day, where just one individual wrestled with this question: how much do I want to remember about what I did in the past? Maybe, I could go to my grave quite happily, never really looking hard at some of the sadder or darker passages of my life. But usually there is something quite powerful that says, no, you have to look at it. You have to look at it, because otherwise there's something false about your life. You cannot be at peace as you come to the end of your life unless you look at everything. There is a need to do without the self-deception and the mist, and the same thing applies in this case to this marriage.
Why did you want to look at an old married love?
It's not because it's not because they're old. I guess they're not even that old by our standards. Back in those days, people in their late 40s would be elderly. So it's not so much age as, I think love stories When we talk about love stories, we often what we mean is courtship stories. A lot of the time, what we mean is a story about two people coming together, and typically the story comes to an end when they come together and declare their love for each other. But I was interested in what I think is a proper love story, because love isn't about when you first meet. It's about the many, many years you spend together, and when you try and keep that flame burning, against all the different changes, all the different climactic conditions that threaten to blow it out. So this is a story about these two people who basically, really love each other, and they're going to stand by each other right to the very, very end. But it's hard for them. And I guess the question about shared memories and the role shared memories play, I mean, it's a kind of a lens through which I can look at their love, their relationship, as well as a lens through which I can look at, a troubled society, how they can maintain peace or not maintain peace.
When you say that they'll be together right till the end, then that becomes an important element of the story, because early in their journey they encounter a boatman who ferries people to an island at the end of their lives, and he questions each couple about their love, how strong their bond is. Ultimately, of course, we do die alone. But why was that idea of the possibility for a shared afterlife important to you?
Well, I've touched on this before in my previous novel, Never Let Me Go. I mean, it's formulated slightly differently, but any of your listeners who know that book will recognize this immediately, that, I mean, at the heart of that book, there is a wish on the part of the two of the characters that although they realize that their fate is to die young, if they can prove that they're truly in love with each other, they'll be given some sort of a concession. They'll be given a little bit of time, at least, a deferral, so that they can actually spend some time together. This is a variation on that idea, I guess. It's a little bit more absolute. It's an old couple who think their love is so special that perhaps death itself will give them a concession. They can go into death together. And they don't, I guess, like the couple in Never Let Me Go, the couple in The Buried Giant, they don't ultimately fear death. They would accept death. What they fear is being separated. If only they could be together, they'll accept anything. And so that's their biggest fear. But I mean, maybe this is something that people will recognize when I say this. I mean, that if we're lucky enough to find love, and if we're lucky enough to hold on to it over a long period of time, you feel special. You feel like maybe this is something hard won and very special, and that you should get something, special, in return. That maybe the usual rules don't apply to you. I mean, this is folly, and this is foolishness. But there's something about human nature, I think, that you want to believe that sometimes your bond is so strong. I mean, it's not just between couples, but sometimes between parent and child, or friends or siblings may feel this too. That sometimes the human bond of love is so strong that you think surely it can overcome.
You mentioned your last novel, Never Let Me Go, which looks at a group of young students at an English boarding school, and it's revealed that they're clones, they're being groomed for organ donation, and they also have to come to terms with the end of their lives. What got you thinking about end-of-life questions from a young person's perspective?
Well, that's what you might call, I mean, we know about the human lifespan. We all know that, we have a kind of average number of years that we live if we're lucky. And so we've kind of trained ourselves not to think too much about, aging. It's something we put off until we are aging. I thought it would be interesting to have a story where by the time you're 30, you're having to face the big questions that the rest of us in the real world, if we're lucky, will get 70, 80, 90 years to think about. But I wanted gradually, as people read Never Let Me Go, to start getting a sense of recognition that there's something oddly familiar about what these kids are going through in their 30 or so allotted years. And that by the end of the book, I wanted people to think, actually, this is our story. This is the universal story about going from youth to middle age to old age, and what do people want to get right before it's too late? What really matters? And one of the things that really matters in Never Let Me Go, it turns out that it's two people who've always loved each other. They want a chance to declare that love to each other, so that each of them know that. And they want some time to be together, even if it's a short period of time. And once again, it's that same hope. They think naively, if they can only prove the strength of their love, surely people will see that and give them a concession. I don't have a morbid fascination with mortality.
Although
it's just
these
there.
characters in that novel and this one do have to face, well, as we all do, I guess, life's biggest questions of love and death.
Yeah, but I think they're quite... I mean, it might sound rather gloomy or melancholy, but actually I like to think of both my portrayal of Axel and Beatrice, the couple in The Buried Giant, and Kathy and Tommy in Never Let Me Go. I think I have an optimistic view of human beings there. You know, that they live against this sad fate, which we all have to accept as human beings. But as people, I think that they're decent people. They have decent qualities, and these are the things that come to the fore when they're faced with these questions of mortality. They don't turn into people who compete against each other, or they want more material possessions before they die, or anything like, you know. They don't want to kind of get vengeance before they die. I mean, they want to express their love for each other. They want to forgive people. They want to ask forgiveness of people that matter. You know, these things become important, and so I kind of think in these books I've become, in a way, more optimistic about people. You know, because my earlier books were always focused on the failings of human nature. These days, I feel I have quite a cheerful time writing these books, because I set myself the task of celebrating the decency of ordinary people.
Although it's true, in your earlier books, you have written about the elderly before, often looking back on a very troubled past. Has growing older affected how you portray older characters?
I guess that inevitably, yeah. I mean, when I was portraying elderly characters when I was a young man, I think they were not exactly projections into the future, but they were kind of like warnings to myself. Because typically they weren't really about elderly people. They were about elderly people looking back to when they were younger. And so it was a way of trying to get perspective on my own life. You know, saying, look, this is how I'm thinking. I might be quite confident right now I'm doing the right thing. But can I be sure? History has an odd way of casting a completely new perspective on the values that we hold. If I just project myself into the future and imagine myself looking back on the apparent certainties I have today, the smugness and the pride I have today.
When you're around 30, that's precisely when you feel that most strongly.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it was a way of... So those novels are almost written out of that instinct. You know, in my 30s, I'm writing about looking back on people in their 30s and 40s. You know, would I have regrets? They're kind of ways of fighting a complacency and a smugness. Whereas as I approach the age of my elderly narrators, I guess I have a different perspective. I mean, I'm no longer just trying to give little warnings to myself. You know, I have become interested in things like, I guess in the Buried Giant, the long slog, if you like to call it that, of love, the long haul aspect of love, and how you keep that love alive, and almost the end game of a long relationship. What do you do when you know that time together is limited? You know, what matters?
You've said that your subject is memory and the dilemma between memory and forgetting. Why do you think that question has stayed with you over more than 30 years now?
I think it's kind of moved on. As I say, I think earlier on I was very much concerned about just one individual struggling with personal memory. And I think that was, in those days, a way of talking about people who waste their lives despite their best intentions. It was a way of saying, you know, most of us don't have great perspective on the climate in which we live. And if we're unfortunate enough to live in a time of, say, fascist fervour or nationalist fervour or whatever, many of us may not be remarkable enough to stand beyond the tide, you know, above the tide. And we might just get swept along, and we might have very good intentions about how we want to lead our lives usefully and well, But if we're unfortunate to live in certain times, we may well look back and come to regret it. So I think a lot of the time, those stories about hiding from one's own memories had to do with lack of perspective, misplaced energies, misplaced values. These days, I think I possibly slightly moved on. I've become interested. I have become interested in how societies remember and forget. Who controls the memory banks of a society? Is it oversimplifying just to say the history books are the memory banks? I mean, maybe it's the media, maybe it's the entertainment industry, maybe it's the museums, maybe it's books and literature, maybe it's just what people tell each other in bus queues and in bars. And I don't know where the memory lies, but I mean, I've become quite fascinated in that question. How do we remember as a community? How do we remember within a marriage? How do we remember in a family?
Kazuo Ishiguro, to go back to the buried giant, your characters argue for and against vengeance, though one of them had managed to broker an earlier peace agreement between the Saxons and the Britons. Why didn't it hold?
Well, I discovered when I was doing this, I put this word research in inverted commas because I have to keep stressing historians do not agree at all on what happened in this period, in the post-Roman period in Britain. But there is some evidence that there was an earlier version of some sort of Geneva Convention, just to put it very crudely, and that, they can do war with each other, but there was an agreement to actually spare the innocents. And this wouldn't be remarkable when you think about it. When people are having wars, this idea is bound to come up over and over again. Please don't harm our children, our elderly, our sick, our women, and in return we won't do that for you. Let's just meet as warriors in the field of battle. I think this is an idea that it doesn't require something remarkable, but it does require something remarkable to actually maintain it and sustain it and actually really broker it. And there is some evidence, although it might be very skimpy, that there was an attempt to do something like this back in those days. And so I thought this was an interesting thing. I thought, well, maybe this was something that was done in the time, a generation before when my story takes place, when the quasi-historical King Arthur was around, that there was some such Geneva Convention agreed, and that at a certain point this was broken deliberately, because perhaps inevitably these kinds of agreements always break down. Not just because one side sees an opportunity to completely defeat the other, but it's often that. But in this case, perhaps there was an argument to say that this is the only way to break the never-ending cycle of violence. You have to wipe out everybody, because while you spare women and children, you're just creating the next generation of warriors, and it's just going to start up again.
The end of the enchanted fog, which has been clouding people's memories, would introduce or quash any other attempt at peace. It would introduce a resumption of war. And we were talking earlier about that cycle of violence and the need to forget. Does it have to be all or nothing? I mean, I'm thinking, for instance, in terms of international conflicts, the Truth and Reconciliation process in South Africa or elsewhere. Can countries or regions negotiate in other ways?
I think they can, and I think yes. I mean, South Africa is a shining example. I think they were helped by having remarkable leaders. But if you just look at the history of Europe, I think what's been achieved in Europe since the end of the Second World War is a real cause for celebration when you consider what Europe was like in the first half of the 20th century. In fact, for much of the 19th century. I mean, it's such a place of just bloodshed and war that it's almost unbelievable that the Europe, certainly the Western Europe that we know, was created in a few years after the Second World War and then after the Cold War. Much of Europe has become this place where people can just flow freely from one place to the other. I think the key thing here is that if a peace is properly negotiated, if it's actually based on consensus and consent, it has a chance of lasting. But sometimes a peace is just imposed from above through military conquest. And I think we've seen examples. I guess the disintegration of Yugoslavia being a key case in point. But we see it often when some empire crumbles and all kinds of wars break out. If the peace has been actually just enforced, then a lot of the old hatreds and enmities are below the ice. It's just frozen and preserved, just waiting to come out again when the strong arm is removed. And all hell breaks loose, when the strong arm or dictatorship or whatever, that's keeping that lid down, goes away. And I think we've seen this recently in the Middle East as well. That we started off kind of celebrating the removal of some sort of horrible dictator, and then we think, well, what's been let loose here? I think it's very difficult to create peace if it's not based on consent and proper negotiation. And often, I guess, peace isn't. Peace is imposed by military victory.
Kazuo Ishiguro, I'd like to look at your own background for a moment. Your father was an oceanographer, and you've said you didn't even really see much of him until you were 4. What was he like?
He was he was a typical scientist, but he was like an inventor. And he just worked on his own project all his life. And I guess although we are very different, and I always thought we were very different because I was in the arts and he was a scientist, and he didn't really read books at all, and I didn't understand science at all. I guess I realized now that one of the things we had in common was the ability to just kind of work uncommissioned on our own project for year after year after year. And one of the nice things that's happened just very recently is that the huge project that he completed in his lifetime, which ended up as a kind of a huge, rather clumsy-looking, heavy machine that ended up in their garage when he retired. Recently, in fact, just last week, the Science Museum in Britain has acquired it to be a centerpiece in their new kind of oceanographic display place, because they think it's a very interesting piece of machinery that bridges that period of analog to digital. So I'm beginning to see that we're not as different as I thought. We're people that go off into funny little rooms, and we have we spend years and years just working on some kind of thing in our head, bringing it to fruition.
But because of your father's work that your family left Japan for England when you were 5, although initially the family thought it was a temporary thing. But your parents raised you as a Japanese boy without thinking in terms of assimilating into English culture. What did that mean for you to be raised Japanese in England?
Yeah, I don't think that's quite true to say that they didn't want me to assimilate into. There was no attempt to keep me separated. There was no Japanese community of which I could be a part within Britain. I mean, there was just our family and then a lot of English people. So there was no question of my being isolated. No, I was very much encouraged to participate in the local life. Almost immediately, I went to the local Sunday school, although my parents were not Christian and thought the Christian religion was slightly odd. And indeed, because we arrived during Good Friday and there were images of this blooded corpse being tortured on a cross everywhere, being shown to children, my parents were rather shocked. They thought, what kind of thing is this to display in front of children?
But they sent you off anyway.
Well, it was a very different Britain in those days. We were living in a relatively small kind of rural-like community. Milk delivered from the local farm by horse and cart. All the local children just played spontaneously in fields and down the country lane. I became very good at climbing trees. And it was also expected that the respectable kids went to church and went to Sunday school. And I sang in the local choir and became the head chorister. So I was pretty assimilated outside of the home, but nevertheless the plan always was that the following year, maybe the year after that, we would return to Japan, because that's the nature of scientific research. The British government were funding my father's work. They gave him a little department, and he's just allowed to get on with it. He didn't have to teach in any university. This is a great privilege for him, but this was something that was only done, 2 years at a time. And so between the age of 5 to the age I was 15, I was always under the impression that my life would be in Japan, that we were going to go back, and I was a visitor in Britain. I kind of put on hold, emotionally and intellectually, the difficulty I would have, returning to Japan, say by the age of 13 or whatever, and not really being able to speak Japanese at sea in the education system, culturally, not knowing what to do. And having all my friends in Britain, I kind of put that on hold. I lived in a strange kind of suspended way, thinking that, yes, I'm going to go back to Japan. I'll turn Japanese again at some convenient point. But for now, I'm growing into a British teenager. So it did give me a kind of a dual perspective. The family didn't really adopt the attitude of immigrants, saying, this is where we've come. How are we now going to relate to the host nation? It was more, so we're visiting this country. Let's look at the ways of the natives. It's quite interesting the way they do that, isn't it? But there was no sense that this was more than just kind of interest. It wasn't something that we had to decide whether we'd adopt these values, or not adopt these values. So it was always, yes, the people over here do this, rather than the right thing to do is this. So it was, the British do it this way.
But then after you were 15, it was concluded that you and your parents would be staying, and your sisters.
That's when there was a big practical decision made, when my father decided not to take up a university post that had been held open for him back in Japan, and that he would continue to work basically for the British National Institute of Oceanography indefinitely. And I guess it was around that time I thought, okay, that's one less thing I have to worry about. Because not least I was thinking by then, well, would I actually live on in England by myself when my parents went back? So I suppose from then on I started to think of myself in a more straightforwardly British way. I'm someone who lives in Britain. I've been educated in Britain. Yeah, I have this kind of other home background, but basically I'm British, and I guess that's how I grew up. It's kind of a complicated process. There was no ethnic minority community of which I was a part.
It was 29 years after your family left Japan before you returned. You were in your mid-30s. What was it like to go back?
Well, we were very well looked after by the Japan Foundation. I guess that's the government cultural arm. We were hosted by them, and they wanted myself and me and my wife to have a kind of a real experience of Japan over a 2-week period. So we kind of went on tour, not to promote a book, but simply to learn about Japan. It was a fantastic opportunity. Most of the time, I find it fascinating. This is Japan in 1989, at the height of the economic boom. Shortly after that, the economic bubble went. But at that point, it looked like Japan was just going to grow and grow and grow and just leave the rest of the world behind economically. It just looked like a juggernaut that wasn't going to stop. And so it was a remarkable point in recent Japanese history. But I found, we were introduced to a lot of interesting people who they'd set up meetings with just because they would be interesting to us. I found it utterly fascinating, but I never had the sense that I was coming back to anything I knew from before. There was no sense of recognition until I got to Nagasaki. And then I realized that the place I had thought was Japan was in fact this tiny corner right in the south of Japan, a place that a lot of Japanese people traveled to as tourists because it was so different and exotic. The way of life, even the way it looked, was so different, right in the island of Kyushu. And I realized I really appreciated that, what I thought was Japan was actually
your hometown.
It was a hometown. It was my childhood. It was my early childhood. And when I got back to Nagasaki and that little area where I grew up to the age of 5, I did recognize many things. In fact, a lot of the old neighbors were there. My old kindergarten teacher came to see me. We went to the old kindergarten together. I could remember a lot of the little streets. That felt like, coming back. That felt like memory. The rest of Japan didn't. It was a fascinating but foreign country.
Because your mother survived the atomic bomb in Nagasaki at the end of the Second World War. How much did your family talk about that?
It was talked about in a kind of a not a big deal way. It was often like a reference point in time. I suppose partly because, when we were children. I mean, they didn't want to really talk about the full implications. But, I mean, even when I was in Japan, I knew very well that there had been an atomic bomb in the town. I knew this word Genshi Bakudan very well. But people refer to the atomic bomb, Genshi Bakudan, as they were talking about something else. They'll say, that bridge was there, but it got destroyed in the atomic bomb. Or they'll be talking about some old friend of theirs, and the story would end, but then she died in the atomic bomb. So I knew that there was this thing called the atomic bomb, but it was more like a marker in time. And I guess for a long time I thought, every town had an atomic bomb. And in some ways, I mean, that wasn't untrue. Everybody had in Japan had gone through this terrible war experience, and many people around the world had gone through a terrible experience in the Second World War. It wasn't literally the atomic bomb, but it'll be something like it. It was only when I was a lot older, I think I was about 7 years old, and I was living in England, that I was looking in an encyclopedia, and I saw that Nagasaki was an entry in the school encyclopedia, and I thought, my town is in the encyclopedia, singled out, and there was a mushroom cloud next to it, and that's when I really realized that, as far as history was concerned, as far as the rest of the world was concerned, Nagasaki wasn't this place where I'd left all my favorite toys.
and your grandparents.
My grandparents and the department store with the toy floor, on the top floor, and it was, and all those things I remember. No, it was this place with a mushroom cloud, and it was only one or two places in world history ever to have had an atomic bomb fall on it. And I remember reading that with a kind of a sense of pride. And it's a peculiar feeling. But I didn't really, it took me a while to understand that, because my mother, although she wouldn't avoid the subject, it wasn't until I was much older, really adult, that, we really discussed the actual experience, what happened. It was just something that had happened. There was an acceptance about it, just as there was an acceptance about the war.
How has Japan dealt with its collective memory, do you think?
In writing this book, I did think about all the nations that I have some sort of relationship to or affection for. Japan, I think, has completely forgotten its role in the Second World War as aggressors. Basically, it was a militaristic, fascist, expansionist, empire-building nation in the 30s that rampaged through Southeast Asia and China, committing some terrible atrocities, which had been largely forgotten. Not by the people in China and Southeast Asia, but certainly by the Japanese and really by the West. And to some extent, it's a very good reason for that forgetting. The Cold War started really immediately as the Second World War was closing, and it was very much the policy of the Allies to build Japan as rapidly as possible into a non-communist ally in that part of the world, with these two gigantic communist countries, Soviet Union and China there. It was absolutely imperative that there should be a economically powerful, strong, liberal democracy, capitalist one, in that part of the world. And so I think the occupying forces did everything to encourage the Japanese to forget their role as bad guys. And because of the atomic bombs, I think the Japanese tended to think of themselves as victims. And that when they think about the war itself, they think of themselves as victims of foolish, misguided and cruel regime that hoodwinked the nation and betrayed its citizens. But I think to this day there is great discomfort about talking about what happened, what the Japanese army did in Asia. And I think this continues to be a real problem in the relations with, well, particularly with China right now.
Kazuo Ishiguro, initially you wanted to be a singer, a singer-songwriter. What turned you in the end towards writing novels?
I think at a certain point in my life, when I was about 22, 23, I started, for a start, I discovered reading. I hadn't read very much when I was younger. I listened to a lot of music. But I had been writing songs from the age of 15, and it's partly that, career-wise, I was getting nowhere. But I think there came a point when I felt the kind of things I wanted to do, I couldn't do in the song. And when I started to write short stories, and there was a big overlap, I would say, between my last songs and my first stories, in tone, subject matter to some extent, but mainly in tone and style. I felt a kind of liberation when I started to write fiction. I thought, all these things I can do. I got so much more room, so many more dimensions I can explore. Nevertheless, I think many of the lessons I had learnt in all those years of writing songs, I think I took with me into writing of fiction. There's a part of me that is still kind of like a singer-songwriter. I like the first-person narrative. I like a certain kind of first-person narrative, an intimate solo voice, sharing things with a small little audience. I like the pared downness of a certain kind of song, the kind of song I was writing at the end of my songwriting career. I like the way you're almost obliged to use words when you're writing lyrics for a song. You have to be quite cryptic. You have to allude, because you haven't got enough words to kind of paint big pictures or fill in great details. So you have to create things just by kind of hints and allusions, and often the big meanings, you have to kind of leave them out, because that has to be done by the emotion has to be carried by the singing performance and the music. So you can't be self-sufficient. The words can't be self-sufficient on the page. And so all these things I believe I took into my fiction writing style, and that they're still there today. I think the songwriting and how I evolved as a songwriter in my young life had an enormous influence on the way I write fiction.
It's always such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Elena.
Kazuo Ishiguro with me in Toronto 2 years ago upon the publication of his novel, The Berry Giant. He's the winner of the $1.2 million 2017 Nobel Prize in Literature. Writers and Company is produced by Mary Stinson. Katie Swales is associate producer. Technical operations by Dave Field. We always like to hear from you. Our email address is writersandco@cbc.ca. And the telephone number is 416-205-6631. For news and reviews all about books, go to cbcbooks.ca. The executive producer is Tara Mora. I'm Eleanor Wachtel. Next week from Madrid, Javier Marias, Spain's most celebrated and frequently translated living novelist. That's next week. I hope you join me.